Let me read this paragraph about Romans from the book Disciple. Martin Luther calls Romans the chief part of the New Testament, saying that it contains the very purest gospel. It has often brought revival to the church, and it profoundly influenced renowned Christian theologians Augustine, Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, and Karl Barth. Many would say it is the most important theological book ever written. Now, prior to chapter 12, Paul lays out our position with God before Jesus' sacrifice for us on the cross, which is we were destined for God's wrath, since our sin against Him kept us from being in right standing with Him. Paul also dispels the myth at the time that Jewish people were superior to Gentiles, as all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, which is in Romans 3:23. Thirdly, Paul declared that we only became or can become righteous or in right standing with God because of our faith, not works in Jesus Christ, whose perfect life was the only acceptable and final sacrifice for the sin of the human race. Now in chapter 12, we get into the nuts and bolts of Christian living, a practical application of Christian living, if you will. Verse 1 states, in view of God's leniency or mercy to us, He saved us from His wrath through the death of His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. Now what are we going to do for Him in response? Paul answers that question. We are to honor the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for us by offering our bodies as living sacrifices to God. We have a debt to pay to Him after all. By this verse, we already know that something difficult is required of us, because sacrifice means the destruction or surrender of something for the sake of something else. And we also know that death, unlike in Jesus' case, is not required, as we are to be living sacrifices. In verse 2, Paul explains to us how our bodies can become living sacrifices by not conforming to the world and renewing our minds to know what the will of God is for each one of us. Now let's have some fun. As I meditated on this verse, I thought about high school and how most students feel pressure to conform to the in crowd rather than their own personal ideals. Thinking back to my time at Benjamin Evander High School in College Park, I remember what was in at the time, according to the in crowd. At the time, it was in to skip class. It was in to sneak out of your parents' home to go clubbing. It was in to start fights with one another. It was in to think more